extinction is the rule. If some people end up leaving Earth, that should put us on a different evolutionary trajectory. Look at the crew of Artemis 2. This is actually a much more diverse group than we've ever sent to the moon in the past, but there's still very much a narrow swath of human diversity. Survival only matters because you can't reproduce when you're dead.
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Dr. Scott Solomon, professor at Rice University, researcher at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and author of Becoming Martian: How Living in Space Will Change Our Bodies and Minds. Dr. Scott Solomon, what are some of the best arguments you've heard against colonizing Mars?
Well, Mars is a pretty harsh place. So, one of the best arguments is that it's a very difficult place to live for any life, certainly for human life. But, I think at the end of the day, the question is like, why go? Why put people through the challenge of living in such a harsh place, right? I think there's actually plenty of arguments that could be made why we shouldn't do it. To me, also, I think it's important to bring up the ethical questions, right? If we are not just going and visiting a place like Mars, but actually settling it, going and living there and, having children, what are the ethics of bringing a child into that environment, right? A child who can't consent to being subject to all of the risk of being in that harsh environment. So at the end of the day, it's basically just that it's a very, very harsh and unforgiving place to live.
Yeah. Let's get specific on that. We don't know what it's like for a child to be born on Mars, but what are the things that you're thinking of with those ethics?
That's right. Yeah, we actually know very little about human reproduction or child development in environments beyond Earth. The specific conditions on Mars include that it has lower gravity, about 1/3 the gravity of Earth, or 3/8 to be more precise. So we don't actually know what being in a 1/3 gravity environment does to a developing fetus, what it would do to a developing child. So it's entirely possible that a child wouldn't grow and develop in a normal way and become a healthy adult in that partial gravity environment. We know that adults that are in a low gravity environment lose muscle strength and they lose bone density. And so, it seems like a reasonable assumption that something similar would happen to children, but it could actually be worse because as you're first building that bone, right, bone responds to muscle. And if muscle's not having to work as hard against gravity, then you just might not build that strong skeleton. So that's part of it. There's other issues. Radiation is another major challenge of being on Mars. Mars doesn't have the magnetic field that Earth has that is part of what protects us from deep space radiation. Another thing is the thin atmosphere. Our atmosphere is protecting us from some of the radiation of space. And so radiation is hitting the surface of Mars at nearly full strength. There's ways that you can try to shield people from radiation, and we would have to do that just to be able to survive at all on Mars. So the question is, how much radiation exposure are people experiencing there, and particularly young children? And then the last thing I would point out, which I think this is something that people haven't maybe thought about as much as they should, is basically what happens to our immune systems, right? So our immune system when we're born, it basically develops in response to what we interact with, what kinds of viruses, bacteria, other microorganisms we engage with. And, there's a incredible richness of microbiology on our planet. Most of it isn't dangerous to us, but in part that's because our immune system is able to basically fight off anything that would be potentially a threat. None of that exists on Mars. As far as we know, there's nothing currently alive on Mars. We'll bring some stuff with us, right? Whatever microbes are in and on our bodies and on, anything else that we bring along. But it's going to be very little compared to what's here on Earth. So a child who's born and raised on Mars is never going to develop an immune system that would be able to handle most of what we have here on Earth. So I have real concerns about whether a person that is raised that way would ever be able to come back to Earth. I think it would just be very, very dangerous because of the infectious disease risk.
Yeah, I want to get more into that and the nitty-gritty of all of that, and how children probably have to be born via C-section and everything. First, I'm just curious, how important do you think it is that children be born on Mars? I mean, could we in theory have a Mars outpost where
Mm-hmm.
we are bringing people after they're born? Would that count?
Would it count? Well, yes. I mean, certainly there's nothing that says that children have to be born on Mars. If the idea is that we're going to create a self-sustaining settlement, right? A branch of humanity that exists on Mars and doesn't depend on Earth, then of course we would need to have, reproduction, right? You need to have children there. If that's not the goal, if the goal is just to be able to have people that are working there, that are, doing science there, that are engaged in industry there, then that doesn't necessarily require children at all. No. And so in that scenario, you may want to really avoid having children being born there because it may be, as I was saying, so dangerous for them, and it may be setting them up for not being able to easily come back to Earth. So it's really only if you're talking about the idea of having a true settlement on Mars or anywhere that I would say that we would want to sort of go down that route of actually having children and seeing what happens to them.
Yeah. And how important do you think it is that we truly have that settlement?
Well, there's a lot of different motivations that people have cited for this. To me, the one that really resonates is that it may really affect our long-term chances of survival, right? So if you sort of play out, history over the long run, if we look back at history, we can see that there have been, major mass extinction events in the history of Earth, and a few times when all of life on Earth was nearly wiped out. 250 million years ago was the greatest mass extinction event in Earth's history, and it nearly sterilized the planet. We still don't know quite what was the cause of that. There's some different ideas. We do know that the most recent mass extinction event, 66 million years ago, was caused by an asteroid impact, or at least an asteroid impact was a part of that. Those kinds of things will happen again at some point. It's not a matter of if, that at some point a large asteroid will come into the vicinity of Earth again. If we know it's coming, maybe we can stop it. There's work to try to develop the technology that would be needed to do that. But there's no guarantee that we would be successful. So if we want to really ensure our long-term survival, one of the best ways would be to hedge by having people not just on one planet, right? That would increase our chances of making it in the long run.
Yeah. What alternatives have you heard besides colonizing Mars for that strategy?
Well, I mean, the other thing is to try to prevent any of those disasters, right? So, in the idea of like an asteroid impact, we recently had a mission where a probe was sent to an asteroid and actually deflected it, right? So moved it a significant amount. And this was not an asteroid that was headed towards Earth, but the same concept could apply to an asteroid that was headed towards Earth. And so, if we have that ability, first of all, we have to know it's coming, and then we have to, be able to actually reach it and move it out of the way. So that's a possibility. But there's, that's only one of the scenarios for what could threaten our existence on Earth. Another is a supervolcano eruption. This hasn't happened basically since humans have been alive. And so, we don't really have any concept of how catastrophic that would be. That's not the kind of thing we really have any way of stopping. We don't even have that much of an ability to predict when volcanoes are going to erupt. We know kind of that they're becoming more active, but that's the kind of thing that would be really hard to stop if we even knew that it was coming.
Yeah. Scott, we've got a lot more to talk about, but your stuff is so wide ranging. So for those who don't know you, what do they need to know about your background to understand what you bring to this whole question of colonizing Mars and everything else?
Sure. Well, I guess, the main thing is to know that I'm a biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. So I did my PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, studying ants in the Amazon rainforest, of all things. So I've spent many, many years traipsing through the jungles of Central and South America, looking for ants and digging up nests of ants, collecting samples, sequencing their DNA, trying to reconstruct their evolutionary history. So that was one of the things that really, I guess, gave me insights into just the process of evolution. But also, there's interesting connections between ants and people, right? They live in complex societies. They have a division of labor. They're actually growing food. They're using, antibiotics to treat disease. Like, they do a lot of things that we used to think were uniquely human. So I think partly my training as an evolutionary biologist studying ants, in a weird way, sort of led me to think more about people. But I was always interested in people. I actually, as a college student, really got fascinated by the study of human evolution after taking some anthropology classes. And so what ended up happening was that as a new faculty member at Rice University, where I'm a professor, I was teaching introductory biology. I was teaching my students about evolution, and I wanted to make the point to them that evolution isn't only about studying the past. It's also about the ongoing process of evolution. And so we started talking about whether humans are still evolving today and how we might evolve in the future. And I ended up taking that concept and writing a whole book about it, a book called Future Humans that came out in 2016. And that was what led me indirectly into thinking about space, because at the very end of that book, I tried to explore different scenarios for what our long-term future evolution might be. And one of those scenarios was, well, what happens if if some people end up leaving Earth and going to live somewhere else? Based on what we understand about how evolution works, that should put us on a different evolutionary trajectory. So that's the thread that I kind of picked up and explored in more depth in my more recent book, Becoming Martian.
Yeah. And in Future Humans, what were some things about how we're still evolving that might surprise people?
Yeah, well, one thing is just to note that we definitely are still evolving, but there's, different ways in which evolution can happen. And this is important because, we tend to think about natural selection. That, of course, is the contribution that Charles Darwin made by pointing out that, natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. It's definitely an important mechanism of evolution, but it's not the only one. And so one of the other contributions Charles Darwin made was to point out that it's not only survival that matters. We tend to think about survival of the fittest, but I always tell my students survival only matters because you can't reproduce when you're dead. At the end of the day, reproduction is actually what matters more to evolution. It's passing on copies of your genes to the next generation. And so there's this great moment in Darwin's life in which it probably wasn't great to him, but it's great in hindsight thinking about him and trying to understand him, because he wrote a letter to a friend saying that every time he sees a peacock, it makes him sick. And it's like, what? Why would this is like the great naturalist Darwin? Like, why does peacocks are beautiful? Why does it make you sick? And it was because he was struggling to explain how natural selection, his theory, could explain a peacock's tail. It just seems so extravagant and if anything, a hindrance. Like, how would having this big, giant, bright tail help you to stay alive? Wouldn't it make it easier for a predator to spot you and then catch you? And so he eventually worked out that, well, okay, if that tail makes it more likely that a male peacock attracts a mate and then passes on their genes, he doesn't have to survive that long. He just has to survive long enough to mate and reproduce and pass on his genes. So he developed this other theory of sexual selection to help explain peacocks and many other species. And so I think one of the things that is surprising, or was surprising to me as I was researching this topic, is that although natural selection is still operating in humans, in some ways, sexual selection might actually be the more important, more influential aspect of our evolution today, because there's less variation among modern people today in survival most babies that are born
Hmm.
end up surviving into adulthood. Now, that isn't true everywhere in the world, so we have to be clear about that. But for the vast majority of the human population, a baby that is born has a pretty good chance of surviving into adulthood. Now, how many children does every individual have? That's highly variable. That continues to be highly variable. So there's basically more opportunity for traits to evolve that are related to fertility and reproduction than traits that are related to survival. So sexual selection might actually be a more important evolutionary process today than natural selection. And that's something that I think is true just of kind of the modern era.
So then how does that shape us? Does that make us more like peacocks?
We actually don't know that much about sexual selection in humans. This was the other thing that really
What?
blew my mind. I know. Isn't that shocking? You would think that of all the things that we know, I mean, we're so obsessed with sex, you would think that that would be the thing we would know the most about. But, probably for good reasons, we haven't done a lot of the same kinds of experiments that we do, say, with animals, birds or insects or fish, right? We can sort of understand how sexual selection works in those species because we can do things like cut off a peacock's tail and see if it affects his mating success, or give extra spots on the tails of peacocks and see if that, affects their reproductive success. Nobody is proposing that we do those kinds of experiments on humans. At least I hope they're not. So that means that we actually don't know as much. So here's an example of something shocking that we don't know. Most animal species that reproduce sexually have pheromones, sex pheromones. I mean, this is why, when dogs go and pee on the fire hydrant and then the next one comes and smells it, they're smelling these pheromones that they're using to communicate with one another. We don't know if humans have sex pheromones. There's a lot of evidence that seems to point towards pheromones, and you can certainly go online and find products that claim that they have human sex pheromones that are being sold as, potent sexual stimuli or whatever. But we don't actually know if human pheromones exist when it comes to sex and reproduction.
I am really surprised by this. I mean,
Yeah,
I could have a whole YouTube show devoted to sexual selection in humans, and it would be popular, and I
yeah,
would have sponsors lining up. It's a topic that people are crazy about.
sure.
Um,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but we
We have
don't
some
we
big
don't know
blind
very
spots.
much.
Yeah, it's wild. So, as much as we, know about ourselves, you would think that humans are the species we would know the best out of all living species, but we have our blind spots.
Wow. Okay. We're really going off on a tangent now, but I had a woman on my show recently who's she's an evolutionary scientist. Her name is Dr. Danny Solokovsky, and her theory is that basically human mating is driven by female competition. That
Hmm.
it's women who are seeing each other as competitors. Because for men, basically, you don't really worry about other men, because if you killed off a bunch of men in your tribe, another guy could show up and still get everybody pregnant, and then his genes would pass on. So for men, you're just concentrating on your goal ahead. But for women, if you can slow down the competition, the reproduction of the other women around you, you have a better chance of success. I wonder what you think about that theory.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess I'd want to see what is the evidence that supports it, right? So, like anything in science, one thing that's interesting is you think about so. Usually, in most animal species, if there is sexual selection operating, and specifically the kind that you were just describing, which is competition for access to mates,
Mhm.
that usually leads to some sort of physical differences in males and females. And the peacocks are the classic example, right? Why do the males have these big elaborate tail feathers, but not the females? Females are called peahens, and they're much more modest in their, feathers. And so we think of that difference in males and females as being driven by sexual selection. So anytime we see a species that has males and females that look physically different in some ways, understood as being the result of typically of competition for access to mates. And humans, we have just a very slight amount difference, physical difference between males and females. So there's like a little bit of, height difference on average, right? On average, men tend to be slightly taller than women, but it's not very extreme the way we see in some species, even in some of our closest relatives. So if you look, for example, at like gorillas, where a male gorilla is substantially larger than female gorillas, right? It's less true of chimpanzees, although it's true to a certain extent of chimpanzees. So that seems to suggest that there may have been, at least historically, some amount of sexual selection, and specifically related to mate choice in humans, but not huge amounts. So, that would be one thing. Now, that's talking about what happened in the past. A different thing is to talk about what has happened today. And one of the things that I explored in that book, Future Humans, is the idea that the cues that we are using for mate choice decisions, like what do we, when we find another person to be attractive and are looking for a romantic partner, like what are we looking at? What are we considering? I mentioned we don't know if we have pheromones. Smell is something that people have studied, and there are important odor cues that we use. But if you think about how are people meeting today, one of the things that is fascinating to me is the rise of dating apps and online dating, and that being one of the main ways how I met my wife, and it's become, actually, at least in the US and in many other places, it's become the main way, the most common way that couples get together. And so if you think about what kind of information are people using when they're choosing who, it's not necessarily like who they're gonna marry, but like at least who they're gonna maybe go out on a date with. So it's kind of this first step in many cases in the process. You can't use odor cues for, on your dating app, at least not that I'm aware of. So there's visual information, there's whatever information people share about themselves, which may or may not be accurate, so there's that whole thing. But it's definitely different from how people met and got together in the past. So that is a rapidly changing, that's an example of technology is changing the ways in which we are doing these basic biological activities, like choosing a partner.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. At the start, the first filter is two-dimensional images that may or may not be touched up, and text. I mean, that's a really, really narrow band to try to, assess a person.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
And fundamentally different from what's happened in the entire history of our species and every species that came before it.
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna walk it back to C-sections in space. But another thing that you mentioned was that we now have technology to deflect an asteroid.
Yep.
That could be an existential risk to the planet.
Yeah.
Now,
well, we're working on the technology, I would say. Yeah. I'm not confident yet enough to say that we could definitely do it if one was coming. But yeah, we're working on it.
Okay. Now, we don't have effective technology to stop nuclear weapons. If you look at what's been developed, we have about 40 of these missiles that are something like a bullet trying to hit a bullet to deflect missiles. And Russia has 1,000 nukes. So the threat of nuclear war here, it seems much more imminent, and yet we don't have effective technology to stop it. What do you think about the importance of Mars as it relates to the threat of nuclear war back on Earth?
Well, yeah. So as I was saying, if the idea is that we want to ensure our long-term survival, being on Mars or being sort of, multiplanetary is an effective way to do that. And that would be an effective way of ensuring against any kind of, global disaster, whether it's external, like I was talking about earlier with an asteroid or I would put a super volcano as external to us as humans. But it could be something self-imposed. It could very well be, a nuclear war that threatens our survival. Or it could be, catastrophic climate change that is caused, at least in part, by people. And so, there's any number of ways that we could wipe ourselves out. Another type of a disease outbreak, another pandemic that is, much more devastating than COVID-19 was. There's any number of ways that we could, cause our own demise. So I think it just highlights that we can't assume we'll always be here. The vast majority of all species that have ever lived on our planet, it's like 99.99% are extinct. So
Mhm.
the extinction is the rule in life, in the history of life, and so we should expect that that's the default, is that we too will eventually become extinct. But we're also the only species, as far as we know, in the history of life on Earth that has been aware of that fact and then might be able to do something to stop it. And I'll say might because I think it's unclear whether we truly could stop it, even if we knew it was coming.
Yeah. It seems a colony on Mars too would still be dependent on Earth. I mean, we could aim to get past that,
Hmm.
but in at least, a good chunk of what it's going to take to get things rolling, going to be dependent on Earth for supplies and communications and guidance and
Oh yeah,
really
yeah.
having enough people. How important is life on Earth? What would it take to kind of get independent of Earth?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think certainly in the early stages. I mean, I think becoming truly independent and self-sustaining is a high bar for a settlement anywhere beyond Earth. And I think you're right. I think it's unclear that we could even achieve that. I mean, it would take a lot. I mean, there's so many things to talk about, right? So materials is one thing. I think initially you'd be sending a lot of those materials. Eventually, you would need to be harvesting materials locally, what's called in situ resource utilization. You want to be, mining metals, and using local supplies that would include things like, water. Um, but that won't necessarily be what they do straight away, right? You'd have to get to that point. Growing food, right? Producing your own food. Um, but you would also need industry, right? You would need to have a local industry, a local economy. Think about healthcare. You'd need to be fully self-sufficient in terms of the ability to provide healthcare for everyone living there. Um, and energy is another huge aspect of being independent. You would need to have a source of energy or multiple sources of energy that weren't reliant on Earth or from people with knowledge about them from Earth. And then just having a population that is self-sufficient, large enough, diverse enough. Having a small population makes any species vulnerable. I mean, this is what conservation biology is all about. Anytime you have a small number of individuals, we call them an endangered species. And it's because there's so many ways in which being small in number makes you vulnerable. And so just growing a large enough population by itself will help to make that population more self-sufficient. So there's a lot that it would take to truly no longer depend on Earth in any way. And that's necessary if the idea is that some disaster happens on Earth, but that, branch of humanity could keep going.
Right. So if our rationale for colonizing Mars is that we want to have a place where humanity can continue should everything fall apart on Earth, then we have to be so strong in that colony that it can function independent of Earth, which we've just said has huge barriers.
That's right.
So to actually be effective in that goal, it's not just getting to Mars, and it's not just even getting some people there or maybe even being able to have a baby there. It's so much. How long would something like that even take? I mean, this is a massive undertaking.
I think it is. And one of the things I've tried to do is to highlight exactly how challenging it is. And I think, people have
Mhm.
thought a lot about the technologies that would be necessary to keep people alive in space. My focus is really on the biological aspects. And so, I'll just say a few things about that because I think it's easily overlooked. We sort of sometimes can assume that, like, well, if we build, enough places and we have that industry, we have all of those, components, things that people need, then the people will be fine. Well, not necessarily. We don't even understand exactly what future generations of humans living in that environment might be like. I mean, they're likely to change in substantial ways. So there's that. And then there's the idea that, like, people might not be content to stay there, right? Like, would would children many generations in the future born on Mars, would they not want to come to Earth? I think it's naive to assume that they'd be content to just stay there, and we don't know how difficult that would be for them to come back, as we were talking about earlier. So Yeah, I just think there's a lot of aspects of our biology that we would need to better understand before we could, actually expect that future generations would be self-sufficient.
Hmm. So let's go deeper on that. I understand from reading your work and listening to you with other people that basically it's unlikely that even if a woman could get pregnant on Mars, that she could have a vaginal birth. So we'd need a C-section to do that, which would then reduce pressure on keeping the head size small. So are we ending up with a whole different species?
Yeah, so this is one scenario, basically, that is what I would say. So, as I said before, we think that being in a lower gravity environment, like the 130 G environment on Mars, would cause bones to weaken in a way that's similar to what we see in astronauts in a weightless environment. If that's true, then a woman who was born on Mars and was living her entire life there, by the time she goes to become a mother and give birth, her bones are likely to be substantially weakened. And that's why I think pregnancy is likely to be much more risky for people on Mars, because they're going to be going through, pregnancy and childbirth with weakened bones. And we know that some of the bones that tend to weaken the most in lower gravity include the pelvis and the hip. And these are, of course, very important for just the process of childbirth. We know that a pelvic fracture can be life-threatening in the context of childbirth. I think there's a couple of different ways that could go, right? One is that there's nothing we can do about it, and we end up with a lot of maternal mortality. You could have a lot of child mortality that goes along with it, right? If the mother's life is threatened by that complication, that the child's could be as well. Over time, that could actually lead to natural selection operating to do something like make the bones stronger, even in the lower gravity environment. But the other possibility is we intervene. We use, medicine and technology, and we do things like make every birth a cesarean section, a C-section, so that the chances of both mother and baby surviving are higher. It seems to me like that's the more likely scenario. I think that's what we would all prefer to happen. So if that does become the case, and you just make all births C-sections, one of the interesting side effects of that is that you have removed one of the major constraints that has existed throughout the history of human evolution. And that is that, even with our big heads that came with our big brains that evolved in our ancestors, you still have to fit the head through the birth canal. And that has been a constraint, and it's affected, a bunch of different aspects of human biology. And, we could talk all day about that. But if that constraint doesn't exist anymore, now you have the possibility of the human head actually expanding, growing larger in subsequent generations. So, yeah, I've argued that you could actually have the evolution of, a human species on Mars with larger heads, which I suppose starts to look a little more like some of the sci-fi depictions of aliens, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we don't know which way anything is going to go, I guess. Like, will
That's
people
true.
be shorter on Mars? There are reasons to
Mm-hmm.
think they might be, but there are
Yep.
also reasons to think they might be taller.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's sort of unpredictable. I mean, for you as a scientist, how do you even look at those questions?
No, you're right. And we have to be clear about that. We can never predict with any certainty what the future of evolution will be, because by its nature, evolution has certain aspects of stochasticity that make it not possible to predict. But we also do know that evolution has historically followed certain patterns. So, for example, you see the same type of animal evolving multiple times independently. Like, it's been kind of famous recently that like crabs or a crab-like shape has evolved multiple times repeatedly in evolutionary history. There's a lot of things that have evolved to be anteater-like. I have to bring it back to ants. That's just I'm contractually obligated. But there's a lot of different things like that where different, very distantly related species have evolved to be very similar to one another, and that tells us that, yeah, evolution has some randomness to it, but it also can fall along somewhat predictable lines. And there's even been interesting experiments that have demonstrated this using things like, cultures of bacteria to sort of see like, well, how often do you get the same thing evolving? And it turns out that sometimes it does happen sort of similar ways over and over again. So I would argue like, I think there's nothing that we can say about how we might evolve in the future. We can use what we know about how evolution works to kind of say, well, there's some things that are more likely than others, and we can look at different possible future scenarios for how we might evolve. So, I think it is important to be clear that we don't have a crystal ball and we can't say with any certainty, but we can look at basically the precedents that we have from 4.5 billion years of Earth history and the incredible richness of life on Earth, and ask like, what are the common patterns that we see, and try to apply that to these future scenarios.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder what you think about changes in the brain, really. In reading your work, I got the idea that you said that big changes in our brain size really, rather than features, changed a lot when there was a lot of volatility in climate. So now we go to Mars, where there's volatility in the whole environment. Would we expect the same thing? Would we expect brain changes? And given that we assume people are going to be born by C-section, so then there's less pressure on the head as well. I mean, what do you think about changes in the brain?
Yeah, this is really interesting because what seems to be the case is that if you look at in our evolutionary history, as you were saying, when our sort of brains really started to rapidly expand, it coincides with a time in which the climate was very, very volatile, basically like rapidly changing. And so, it's important to point out correlation is not causation. So we can't say with any certainty that is what triggered the change in our brain size, but you can imagine that there's at least a plausible scenario in which that was one of the major factors. So under that hypothesis, it's really kind of like natural selection is favoring individuals that are good at solving problems because they can't just rely on what they've done in the past, because the environment is changing so quickly. The environment is going from, cool and dry to warm and wet, and that's affecting the vegetation and the kinds of, plants that are available to eat and use, and the kinds of prey animals that are around, and, how you can get shelter, all the different aspects of survival. If you think about, being out on the African savanna, right? So being intelligent may have been one of the kind of survival factors for our ancestors. So yeah, I think, if that's true, if that really is what drove this massive expansion in our brain that started around, 2 million years ago, then yeah, there's certainly at least a precedent for the idea that going once again into a radically different environment, and especially an environment that isn't consistent, isn't constant, but is, somewhat unpredictable, because that seems to be part of what was happening at that time, is that it was kind of this unpredictability of the environment. Being in that type of environment seems to maybe, give an advantage to individuals that are more clever, more able to solve problems. Although I want to point out also that it's not necessarily just about an individual being smart. Yeah. We think that one of the real reasons our species survived and others didn't is that we're good at working together. Some of the time, not always. Yeah. So, sometimes it feels like we're not very good at working together, but in general, especially compared to other species, we are very social, and we are, particularly good at communicating with one another. I mean, we have such complex, sophisticated language, and that allows us to communicate in complex ways and share knowledge, and that probably was a major factor in our survival during that those unpredictable times.
Yeah. It seems that the social element in this theory makes the most sense, right? If we're not going to develop some extreme feature because the weather is always changing, so we don't want to get pigeonholed into one thing, And then on Mars, the same idea, perhaps. So we get more developed in the social brain instead. I do want to talk about society and how that would change too. But I'm just curious, have you read Dune?
No, I never have actually. Yeah,
Okay.
it's on my long list of things that I know I need to read, but I
Okay.
haven't gotten to it yet.
Without spoiling it, I can tell you that the world that things start in is after something called a Butlerian jihad. And I know you do sci-fi, so I'm sure you can hang with all this.
Yeah.
So Butler, this idea that, we're not going to make machines in the image of a man, that kind of stuff. So what's happened is through this society of all these different planets, people have developed to be very extreme. So there are some with certain types of extreme intelligence, social skills, some even like witchcraft. Um, I wonder how extreme do you think a human could get if we are evolving in an environment like Mars without constraints on how big the head and potentially the brain could be?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. I think we have to really be kind of humble about what we think evolution is capable of. I mean, if you
Mhm.
just look at the incredible diversity of life on Earth, evolution has has come up with some pretty wild structures and strategies. And I mean, it's part of what I love about being a biologist is that life is just almost infinitely complex and diverse, and it is just fascinating. So the question is like on what time scale are we talking
Mm,
about, right? So, if you wait long enough, and if our descendants survive long enough, almost anything it seems is is possible. Now, there's constraints, that come more from physics maybe than from biology. But I hesitate to say there's any limits really on how we could evolve. It's just sort of like, well, maybe one caveat I should put on that is that natural selection by itself can't make new forms. It's really mutation is the ultimate sort of creative engine when it comes to evolution. And so you have to have some kind of new mutation that allows for a certain trait to exist. So as much as we would like to have cool features like wings or something like that, you can't just sort of like say, well, it would be advantageous to have wings. So why didn't they evolve? Well, you have to have, a mutation, or in this case, it would be many, many mutations that would give rise to wings. And then the individuals with wings have to, survive a little longer and pass on more copies of those wing genes than other individuals do. So it's important to like clarify that, natural selection can only work with whatever exists. And how those new traits come into existence is ultimately through mutation, and the swapping around of genes that comes with sexual reproduction.
mhm. Well, we could open the transhumanism door a little bit. I mean,
Mm,
what about taking things into our own hands with
yeah.
technologies? We have technologies like CRISPR, which we don't want to overhype, but we're already at a point where we can start to alter our genes independent of waiting for a mutation. What about taking it into our own hands?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important thing to talk about because you're right. We do have, in theory, the technology to basically give us some of those superpowers now, right? I mean, if we knew what genetic changes to make, and if we knew that we could make those changes safely and that they would be effective, then yeah, we know how to make the changes. That's actually not the problem anymore. It's knowing the other things. Um, so yeah, this was a fun part of the book to research. Going and visiting synthetic biologists in their labs and kind of seeing the ways in which they're trying to do this already today. I visited Chris Mason's lab at Weill Cornell Medicine, and he's working, among other things, on trying to see if you can put genes from tardigrades into human cells. Tardigrades being kind of famously able to tolerate extreme conditions. They've been brought up into space and are able to, within some limits, survive being in the vacuum of space, survive being exposed to space radiation. And we know a little bit about some of the genetic basis for that. So there's a gene called DSUP, which stands for damage suppressor, that produces a protein, also called DSUP, that helps to basically suppress the damage to DNA caused by radiation. And in some of these experiments, they've shown that human cells grown in culture with those DSUP genes inserted into them or edited into them, they have increased resistance to radiation.
Wow.
So, at least in theory, it seems like some of that would be possible. So yeah, I think, if you sort of take that idea and expand it to think about other genes, other traits that we might think would be helpful to have in a colony on Mars, a space settlement, then that might be an effective way. It might be an important way to help people to survive and thrive in that environment.
Yeah. Where do you think your scientific experience puts you on the question in general of transhumanism, gene editing, things like that?
Well, look, I think I think the promise is there. I think that the potential of using these techniques for alleviating human suffering is enormous. Um, what I would say is that we have to be very clear about the safety and the effectiveness before we can responsibly move forward with doing those kinds of things. So I also think we need to be very clear about the difference between somatic gene editing and germline gene editing. In other words, if you make a change to your skin cells or your liver cells or your brain cells, those aren't going to be inherited by your children. But if you change the DNA of the cells that make sperm and egg, those are the germline cells. Those are inherited by your children, and so that's a big difference. It's one thing for an adult to understand risk and take on that risk knowingly. It is very different for an individual to make a change that will then be inherited by every subsequent generation. And so I think we need to, as a society, have discussions about what is okay and what is not okay. And so to me, I think we have to really get into the ethics of gene editing, as well as understanding the biology, the science.
Yeah. What do you think is going to get us to a good place on the ethics of this? I have spoken with the biographers of James Watson and Francis Crick.
Mm-hmm.
And with both of them, who are also PhD scientists in their own right, we're still very much up in the air. So what do you think it takes to really get to a sense of where we go with this technology?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to know more about our own genes and genomes, right? So part of the problem is we're still learning basic things like what gene has what function. And then it's not as simple as like we used to think like, oh, this gene does this one thing and that's all it does. No, most genes interact with other genes. And so if you change one thing, it has all of these multiplicative effects. So without understanding that, and you just go in and you tamper with something, it's really likely that you're going to have some negative unintended consequences. So for me, it's first of all about having enough knowledge of how our genomes are set up, how they function, to really be able to kind of even have a chance of understanding what all of those downstream consequences are. If we knew what those consequences were, if we had imagine we had this complete knowledge of exactly all of the functions of every part of our DNA, and we understood exactly what making those changes would do, then I think we could talk about like, okay, is it okay to make this change? What are the trade-offs, right? Okay, you get this benefit, but it's at the expense of something else. Those are, conversations that we could have. But doing that without, having that information just strikes me as irresponsible. So I think that's where we're at right now, is being able to just really have enough knowledge of what all these functions are before, certainly before doing any sort of germline gene editing that would have implications for future generations.
Yeah. So Scott, the goal would be to have great information on what it's all going to be like if we do these sort of edits, but we probably won't get that far. How far do we need to get, or what would it take to get close enough?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I don't know. I think to me, I mean, I guess you never have complete information, right?
Yeah.
So, this is kind of like the task of like, the FDA when they're approving a new drug or a new treatment
Mm.
is they're having to say, okay, we have made some amount of uncertainty, but what is it? So, and this is partly why we have like statistics to use in doing research, right? Is to be able to quantify our uncertainty and to be able to say what is our threshold beyond which we are comfortable with saying we think this is likely to be, this thing is causing this other thing, or this thing is, not causing this other thing. So I think, at the end of the day, I'm a scientist. I rely on data. I rely on statistics. And I think we have to keep all that in mind and not sort of lean too much into, human intuition, or this feels like enough, or like
Yeah.
like this seems like a good idea. Like, we need to come back to the tools that we know are effective, which is collecting data, analyzing those data, using statistics to guide our decisions. So uh, we'll always have some uncertainty. I recognize that, but that's why we have statistics to help us to deal with that uncertainty.
Yeah. Scott, a lot of these questions about gene editing, things like going to Mars, are about our relationship to risk. And I think there's a general attitude that adults can take risk and they're kind of free to go and do what they want. So now we have people talking about not only the gene editing, but things like maybe connecting more and more to computers, AI. I mean, we already all are carrying around supercomputers in our pockets every day, but people want to talk about getting them implanted in their brains and things. Is this even a positive evolution? What do you think of using technology as it relates to evolution?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So, I thought you were going to go a slightly different way with that question. So, yeah, we could talk about a number of things related to this. So, in terms of using technology, so this is interesting because, yes, as you're pointing out, like we are used to having some ways in which we embed technology into our bodies, into our functions. I mean, the idea of having, an artificial hip, or
Hmm.
an artificial heart, like a
Hmm.
pacemaker or something like that. Like we've had those technologies long enough that we don't even maybe think about it that much. But that is sort of like, the very basis of this whole idea of being, cybernetic, or being you were saying transhuman before, right? So this idea of like a combination of human and machine, we're already there in some ways. You can have a cochlear implant to help with hearing loss, right? You can have, there's all of these ways in which we embed technologies. Now, the extent to which that is affecting our evolution, that's an interesting point, because so far, I would say they're not any more than any other kind of medical advance, having antibiotics, or, performing a surgery. What they're doing is, prolonging life, and alleviating suffering, and allowing people to live longer than they otherwise would. That could have an effect on evolution because, as I said before, survival is necessary for reproduction, and at the end of the day, reproduction is what matters most for evolution. So it means people who maybe wouldn't have otherwise passed on their genes might be passing on their genes. But you still have to embed that technology every generation. Somebody born with an artificial heart, obviously their children aren't going to have an artificial heart unless you perform that procedure on them. If we get to the point where that's not the case, if we get to the point where there's some sort of a technological um a device, or something like, so let's say an artificial chromosome, that would be an interesting
Mm.
thing to talk about, because now in theory that is something that could be heritable. If it's a device or an implant that is passed to the next generation, then it is affecting our evolution. So we don't have that kind of technology yet, but if we were to get to that point, it would be directly influencing our evolution. So yeah, those are interesting to think about. But it goes back to gene editing. I mean, it would be
Hmm.
affecting our evolution in the same way that gene editing could.
Okay. And then what other technologies could affect the evolution and things that would affect sexual selection?
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. So yeah, right. If you get scratch and sniff dating apps, then that will be
Well,
right,
we have removed that element.
yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our
So that is a
technology
technology
is,
in a way that has amplified some features at the expense of others.
I think so. Yeah, it has. It's kind of in between us and our biology. And so, as that technology advances, and I'm sure it will, you were talking about how we have 2D images to go by if you're using a dating app. Well, maybe at some point we have 3D. Maybe it's a hologram or something like that, or and so you can imagine, well, okay, that starts to affect the way we make certain choices and affects the experience, and in turn affects our evolution. I think that a brain-computer interfaces, a kind of a brain chip idea, is a really interesting one that is coming along. It's there's a lot of advances that are happening in that field, because it is at the interface of our minds and our bodies. Right, the idea that you could control a computer or control a device, an electronic device, a robot, perhaps with your mind. We're still at the point where you'd have to implant that each generation, but that's starting to feel like something that is more kind of, I don't know, more sort of fundamental to who we are, right? Because our minds are so important to us as humans, and how we exist and how we think about ourselves. So that type of technology is something that intrigues me in particular, and especially because there are such advances that are happening with it right now. And I think it could really be relevant for our future in space.
What else are you thinking about with that?
Well, I'm thinking about, we have rovers on Mars right now, but imagine that you had a chip implanted in you that allowed you to control that rover with your mind. It becomes an extension of you and who you are. And now you're starting to almost have something like, we'll come back to sci-fi again, something like, Avatar, where you're basically, you have some sort of a robotic or cybernetic version of you that is out exploring the environment in ways that you'd never be able to. But it causes you to come back to that question that we were discussing earlier of like, well, what is human? Is that human? If it's an extension of you, you're directly controlling it and getting sensory feedback maybe as well. Like, is that human? Are you human? Are you both the human? What is the human at that point? I think that's really interesting.
And what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think, I actually had this moment as I was researching my book where I was at a conference, a space conference, and saw a presentation by a guy named Mike Mongo, a very interesting guy. He's become a friend of mine now. And he said this thing that I had just such a strong negative reaction to it when he first said it. He was talking about AI, and he said, AI is an evolved form of humanity. And I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm an evolutionary biologist. You can't tell me a machine is an evolved form of humanity. That's not how evolution works. But then I just was sitting with that for a while. I saw the whole presentation. It was fascinating. I took a bunch of notes and I talked with him afterwards, and I went home and I was thinking about this. And I was trying to sort of refute his argument in my mind as a scientist, as an evolutionary biologist. And I was realizing okay, where does AI come from? Well, it was created by humans, and as we know, it has many of our human traits, the good ones and a lot of the bad ones too. In other words, we created it in our image, right? It is basically almost sort of like our offspring, right? We've created this thing. Now, it's not independent of us completely, not currently, but at some point it could be. And if it were, if we've created a thing that is like us, different, but like us, and it's made in our image, isn't that basically what reproduction is? And it's, basically it is the next generation of humans. And so that really sort of opened my mind up to thinking about maybe we have too narrow a definition of evolution, and maybe we have too narrow a definition of humanity. And I say we, I'm speaking as a biologist, as a scientist. It made me really kind of want to open my mind up to thinking about this in a broader way. So yeah, I think I'm still wrestling with that idea. Yeah, I mean, I don't claim to be someone who can answer all of these fundamental questions, but I think they're really important. I think they're fascinating.
So with that, we're assuming that the AI functions independently at some point, that it is
Well, it would.
autonomous, that it has its own sort of vision for itself, and that's when it becomes its own thing.
I mean, I think if it got to that point, then then you could start to have a discussion about, is it a new species of human, basically?
Okay.
Is this a new form of humanity? I think as long as it's fully dependent on us and not separate from us, I think it's harder to make that argument. I suppose you could, but I would be less convinced by that argument if it's as it is currently, which, basically we can still turn off the switch and shut down the AI, right? And so, if that's no longer the case anymore, if it becomes fully autonomous and fully independent, there's certainly a stronger case that it is its own life form at that point.
Well, this seems like a biological question. So how important is the actual biology of a human, the reproduction, the matter, the physical stuff, the cells, in saying that something is our offspring?
Well, I would say it comes back to the question of what is life? What does it even mean to be alive? And this is something where there's so many fundamental questions in science, and this is true of biology, that we struggle to answer. You would think that what is life would be like the most basic question in biology. And in some ways it is. And it's also one of the hardest to answer. So questions like, is a virus alive? Right? You could start a fist fight among biologists if you drop into a biology conference and ask them to choose sides on that one. And it's because, on the one hand, a virus can't live on its own. It is not capable of living without a host. It requires a host. And so that, by some definitions, means that, well, it's not alive, right? It can't exist on its own. But by other definitions, like, well, what is it doing? It can reproduce with the help of a host, but it is making copies of itself. It is having an impact on the environment around it. And so by that definition, and it can evolve. That's another definition that biologists like to use for defining life, is being capable of evolution. We know they can evolve. We're all very well aware of that after COVID. So, on that side of things, yeah, it does seem like a virus is alive. So does a living thing need to be capable of existing on its own, or can it be dependent on some other form of life in order to be alive? Depends on how you want to define it.
So another way to answer that question that I've heard, I read a lot of Siddhartha Mukherjee, and he would say, does it have cells? And if it has cells, that might be a good litmus test.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the definitions that biologists like. But I think you could turn that around and say, like, well, is that just a circular definition? All life that we know of has cells. And so then we say life has to have cells in order to be alive. By that definition, you're right. A virus is not a cellular-based life form. And this has implications for space, because if we go to another world and we want to discover, is there life there? Are we assuming that life everywhere has to follow the same principles as life on Earth? Does it have to be cellular? If it did all the other things, if we found something that was capable of reproducing and capable of using energy and impacting the world around it and evolving, but it didn't have cells, we would say that that's not alive. I don't know that that's what we would do. I think people would argue that. So, yeah, it's fascinating. It sounds philosophical, and it is in a sense, but it's also fundamental.
But back to our AI example, if a computer is generating a persona, something that looks like us, is made in our image, can speak like us, whatever, but it's still at the end of the day a computer. How do we square that, or do you envision something else that would fit this definition that your friend has come up with about AI being the next humans?
Well, what is a computer at the end of the day? It's hardware and software, and the hardware is just the material it's made out of, and the software is the code that it uses to perform its functions. You could make an argument that that's what we are too. We've got our things that we're made out of, but then we've got our code. We've got our genetic code that gives our body instructions for what to do and how to do it. And so at our fundamental level, that's kind of what we are as well. So I don't know. I think it's hard to really kind of make it black and white. We would like for it to be black and white, but it's as you drill down into it, it's actually hard to make these definitions really crisp.
Right. And then to say that it is alive because it's like us in this way that it has code and such, but we as humans, we always use the things that are of our time to describe what we're
Yep.
learning about ourselves, especially when it comes to cognition and psychology.
Yeah.
I mean, in the time of the steam engine, then the mind, people were blowing off steam when they were upset and
Right.
things like that. So it's this language feedback loop that seems to be shaping us too. Um, yeah, I'm just not sure.
No, you're absolutely right. Right. I mean, all the comparisons, all the metaphors and analogies that we use are a function of our times and the way that we think about the world. And so, yeah, using the comparison of the mind being like a computer is just the modern version of that. As you said, people used to think about the mind as being like a machine or whatever it is. So, yeah, no, and I'm sure future generations will have a new way of thinking about it. And as we learn more about life, we will have new ways, I am sure, of defining life. And especially if we find things on other worlds that are very different from what we have here. If we go to Mars and we discover that there's life, whatever that is there, if it is different in some way from Earth life, wow, just think about how that's going to cause us to completely redefine not just what that is and what we are, but what else could exist and what it all means.
Yeah, if we meet life that isn't cellular based like us, for example.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. Scott, when I
Or
raise
or isn't organic, isn't carbon based, right?
yeah,
Something like that. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Scott, perhaps people on Mars will feel like they might owe their existence to our mistakes. Could we, by messing up here, actually be driving ourselves toward Mars?
Well, it could be if that ends up being the motivation for truly, making that big leap and going and not just visiting, but trying to create settlements. I could imagine if, say, we knew there was an asteroid on its way here and that it was going to hit here in 500 years, say, or even 100 years. If we knew that was the case, even as we tried to develop ways to stop it, there might be a renewed effort to try to also, create a true settlement elsewhere. And if that were the case, then yeah, I think it would be kind of that moment that would sort of define the future evolution of our species. There could also be disasters. Yeah, that could happen here. It could be that, we fall into the trap of engaging in nuclear war, and that ends up driving people to prioritize leaving Earth. We're just more likely to make mistakes. We're more likely to you know to ease up on our concerns about ethics. Yeah, that's certainly not the future I would hope for.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the biological element of all this. I think we can generally say that the technological element is actually not the limiting factor. What about the societal, social element? What happens when people are living on Mars?
I agree that I think the technological challenges are not the most significant obstacles. I do think the biological obstacles are significant and underappreciated. But yeah, We are social creatures, as we've discussed. We are, political creatures.
Mm-hmm.
We are organized in complex and messy ways. And I don't think we've hit on any, ideal ways of organizing ourselves so far. So, what would that look like on another world? Again, people have argued that that's a reason to go to like, let's start from scratch and learn from our mistakes and get it right this time. As much as I'd like to think that that's what would happen, I'm deeply skeptical about that idea. I just think we're much more likely to repeat the same mistakes all over again. This is not something I feel like I have any special insight into. Like, what would how would our societies develop? How would we govern ourselves? What would the economy look like? What are the consequences for or implications for religion? I think those are all really important, fascinating questions. But as a biologist, I feel very ill-equipped to to be able to address them in any kind of meaningful way.
Well, let's start from what you do know. Let's see it as a colony. So what is maybe the smallest example of a successful colony? Like how big would it need to be to even be successful?
Yeah, so the size of the sort of founding population is really important, and this comes really from. I mean, partly it comes from history. We know of lots of examples of a small number of individuals who, establish a new settlement somewhere. That's happened over and over again in human history. But we also know a lot about this from studying islands and looking at how plants and animals arrive on those islands and then what happens to them. And so I draw a lot of those comparisons in my book, and actually look at the settlement of the Pacific Islands as kind of an interesting comparison to what might happen in space, because the ancestors of the Polynesian people, they were really the world's greatest navigators, and they found pretty much every habitable speck of land in the Pacific. In many cases, it was a pretty small number of individuals that established those populations, and they brought everything they needed with them, they made it to places as far and isolated as like Hawaii and Easter Island. So it doesn't have to be a large number of individuals, but the larger the better in terms of chances of survival. It's not only just the size, though. It's also the composition of those groups that matters. And we know this from studying a lot of island evolution. We have something called the founder effect in evolutionary biology, which is basically the observation that, anytime a small number of individuals founds a new population, the identity of that group and the genetic composition of that group has a big impact on the future success and what comes next. They tend to lose genetic diversity. Basically taking a small number of individuals from a larger group and plopping them somewhere new. They're unlikely to represent the large group that they come from. Now we could make some choices about who we choose to send. It depends on who's in charge here, like who gets to go and be the founding, settlers on Mars. Are they self-selecting? Are they being, told to go? You could imagine a lot of different scenarios, but the genetic diversity of that founding population ends up being really important. So it's the number of individuals, but also how genetically diverse they are. And the more diversity, the more likely that population is to not just survive, but to be able to adapt to conditions in the future.
Yeah. Is there a ballpark and order of magnitude of how many people it would take to start a successful colony on Mars?
Yeah, there has been a number of attempts to try to estimate this, and they vary widely. Some have said as few as 100. There's more that are sort of like in the ballpark of 10,000 to 100,000 individuals. But again, the thing that I hesitate to sort of ever give a number, because you could have 1 million individuals, but if they were all genetically identical, then you're doomed to failure. So like the number only matters because really the larger the population, the more likely it is to be diverse. It's really that diversity that is the most important aspect of, sort of setting them up for success. So really, if you were trying to establish a human population on Mars that was going to be kind of founding a new branch of humanity and you want to set them up for success, you would want to capture as much human genetic diversity as possible. You would want to have it be global. You would want to have, actually, one of the things you'd want to have is a lot of representation from the continent of Africa, because if you look at how human genetic diversity is distributed across the planet, there's actually more genetic diversity in Africa than in the rest of the world combined.
Mhm.
So that's a really important, observation. So yeah, the more genetic diversity, the better.
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time with Navy test pilots and Navy fighter
Mm.
pilots, oddly enough. And, that's usually who gets picked for these sort of things.
It
So
has been historically. Yeah, that's right. Hmm.
how would we figure who we want to take when, I mean, those guys get the job done. Like, they're great at what they do. But they're not going to be that wide swath that we're looking for. How do we figure out who to take to Mars?
Yeah, so it depends on what is the thing that we're trying to accomplish. If it's just to get there, or to get there and establish a base, then
Mhm.
I think sending people like who you're describing, people who basically like the astronauts that we choose today. Look at the crew of Artemis 2. This is actually a much more diverse group than we've ever sent to the moon in the past. But there's still very much a sort of narrow swath of human diversity in many ways, right? They're selected for their health. They're selected for their ability to work well with one another as a group, to perform certain tasks, to not get super motion sick when they get up there. Those are really important because you can imagine all sorts of ways in which the mission could fail if any of those things weren't true. So you probably do want those characteristics. But if all you're doing is selecting those types of traits, then you're going to end up with a narrower swath of humanity than if you're taking that genetic diversity into consideration. So I would imagine this is going to happen in phases, right? You have the first wave that's going and kind of just getting there and getting a foothold and establishing the infrastructure. And then maybe later you start to send people that are sort of the true settlers who are really going on a one-way trip and are there to kind of found or seed this new human population. But, all of this is just sort of dependent on, again, what is the motivation? Are we doing this hastily because we see a threat coming down the line, or are we doing this just to kind of try to have a settlement somewhere else? Are people choosing to go, right? Are people sort of self-selecting, hey, I want to go because I see the possibility of starting a new life or having an adventure or making a profit, or because you're a scientist like me who is motivated by discovery and the awe and wonder of it. Maybe it's some combination of all of those.
Mhm. How do we think about the makeup of who goes then? You can make different arguments for different things. You could say, well, we send a lot of men and they're going to do a lot of labor, or we need to send a lot of women so that we can be sure to have kids, or what questions come up?
Well, again, I think it depends on what your goals are, right? If the idea is you're really trying to create a human society, you need everybody, right?
Yeah.
There's nobody that you don't need. You want to have everyone contribute, and the diversity. I mean, I'm talking about genetic diversity because that's what we know biologically is important over many generations. But you want to have a diversity of skill sets. You would want human cultural diversity to be represented, I would think, right? You would want, hey, you better send some good chefs up there, or you're going to have a bunch of grumpy space settlers, right? We know food is so important, and that goes across cultures, right? So I think you really would, if the goal is to thrive, not just to get up there and survive and eke out an existence, but to really create a new place for humanity to exist. You want humanity. You want as much humanity and as many different types of people as you can get.
Yeah. So if this place is so isolated, I mean, it will be more isolated, I think, than anything we could do on Earth, you know, compared to Antarctica, whatever. Um, there's going to be a lot of risk, I think, of people then becoming a whole different kind of society where there could be extreme attitudes. There could be wars with infighting, things like that. In your book, you wrote about people who were living in sort of a bubble for a while, and there were 8 of them, and then they turned into factions of 4 and 4. It seems that aggression in humans is also kind of part of what we do. What do we do to manage the social, the cultural stuff?
Yeah, I think you were describing the Biosphere 2
Mm-hmm.
project from the 1990s, where a team of 8 people were actually hermetically sealed inside of this enclosure for 2 whole years, and it broke down into these 2 factions that couldn't even speak to one another. They were very hostile towards one another for much of that. And so, yeah, we study kind of these interactions to be able to learn lessons from them. And researchers are looking at like, well, what happens on a polar expedition where people are going into some of the most extreme environments on Earth, Antarctic research stations. How do you kind of increase the odds that the project will be successful, that people will get along and do well? There's a lot of screening that happens to try to make sure that the people that are going are likely to do well. But then there's a lot of also kind of managing people once you're there, and it didn't used to be that way. I mean, gosh, there's horror stories, of course, of the early days of polar expeditions. But I think we've learned a lot now about kind of how to help keep people well, and not well just physically, but mentally, psychologically, emotionally. And I think you have to take those psychological considerations really seriously for any of these uh, efforts. And I think people do today. I think people do take those more seriously than they used to.
Yeah. Well, Scott Solomon, before we get to our last topic, for people who want to learn more from you, where's the best place for people to look for you online?
Oh, yeah, sure. So you can go to my website. It's solomon.rice.edu. You can find me, on social media. I'm on pretty much all the platforms. And then the book, Becoming Martian, is published by MIT Press. You can find it on their website or on Amazon or anywhere you get books.
Great. We'll put some links in the description for people to check out. And last of all, Scott, I'd like to know, what do you think is important in this topic that maybe we haven't touched on? What do you think people who might be considering one day going to Mars should think about? What's kind of on your radar that might be different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we've talked a little bit about microbes and infectious disease. I would say that this might be the biggest potential
Mm,
showstopper in the idea of being able to, actually live on another world. And partly it's because I think sometimes we take for granted the idea that, we live in an ecosystem. We don't just live in a sterile environment. And so when we go to an Antarctic base, or we go, people go on into a nuclear submarine, and they're underwater for weeks or months at a time, or we send people, to space, around the moon in a capsule, or to the International Space Station. We are able for short amounts of time to keep people alive by creating these very artificial environments. But those are always short term. If what we're talking about is building a whole civilization and enabling humanity to truly thrive, we can't just keep a small, enclosed, sterile space. We have to have an entire ecosystem. We depend on all of the other organisms in our environment, starting with the tiny microbial life that live in and on our body and contribute to our health, but also help to, break down and decompose organisms when they die and return their nutrients and energy into the environment. Plants converting sunlight into energy. I mean, we depend in so many ways on the entire ecosystem that we are a part of. And so I think we have to recognize that in order for us to really survive and thrive, we can't just go ourselves. We need to actually bring an entire ecosystem or create an entire ecosystem with us. And so, we have to understand how to do that. I think we're in the early stages still of being able to do that. That Biosphere 2 project, one of the things they were attempting to do is to create actual ecosystems inside that hermetically sealed enclosure, and they were somewhat successful in doing that. But they also had some real challenges. Nobody has yet tried to repeat an experiment on that scale, where you're not just putting people in a place, but actually creating intact ecosystems. And I think that really would be necessary if we're ever going to truly live anywhere beyond Earth.
Yeah. Yeah. What do we know about how to do that well? I mean, you use the word sterilize, but if you send a person somewhere, a person can't survive if they're sterilized.
That's right.
Their body has so much going on. So how do we manage that? What do we know about that challenge?
Yeah, well, you're right. That we know that we require our microbiome, all of the bacteria and other microbes that live in and on our body are necessary for everything from helping us digest our food to fighting off infectious diseases to regulating our hormones and our metabolism and our mood. Um, you know, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, we also are still learning, how do we even get that microbiome? Like, where does it come from, right? It comes from our mother, our parents, our siblings, our other, people that we interact with. Um, and we're still in the early stages of understanding all of the ecological interactions just in our environment. Even simple environments like, take a home, for example, your house, right? Your house is not a sterile place. It's filled with all kinds of living things, from microbes to, tiny insects and maybe not so tiny things, we try not to think about sometimes. But in many ways, that is a part of our environment, and we like to sometimes think about ourselves as being separate from nature and that aspect of our ecosystem. But the reality is, the more we learn, the more we realize we are completely dependent on so many aspects of nature just to keep us alive. So yeah, we still have a ways to go in that regard.
Yeah. Scott, just to round this out, you have raised so many interesting questions about a problem that I think for many people looks like a physics problem. How do we get to Mars, get people there, put them there, lock off the oxygen, and we'll kind of take it from there. Um, what do you think about actually doing this in your reflection, now that you've looked at all this from many angles that a lot of people aren't normally looking at?
Well, I think for one thing, yes, you're absolutely right. It is a much harder problem than what it appears to be if you're just looking at it from the point of view of physics or engineering. Humans are complex beings. Life is complex, and it's not even just about getting the balance of oxygen and food and all of those kinds of things. Even if you're trying to kind of incorporate living systems into it, it's also about like our emotional well-being. I was talking about the importance of the ecosystem. It's not even just for keeping us alive. We also know that, taking a walk in a park or in a forest can lower our blood pressure, can improve our health and our well-being in ways that we're still trying to understand. We just have this inherent affinity for nature. It's what the late biologist E.O. Wilson called biophilia, this just love of living things and nature. And so even if you could keep a person technically alive in an environment that had all of the food and the oxygen, all those other necessities, if we don't have access to other aspects of nature, plants and animals, and even more than that, those ecosystems, it takes something away from us. It takes away some aspect of our humanity that's hard to quantify. And so, I think we have to really recognize that as much as we would like to think that we could just transport ourselves to some other place, and if we knew enough to be able to alter that place to make us able to survive, that we'd be okay. But I don't know if we would. I think
Mm.
I think we need to recognize that we are beings of this planet, and that in many ways that are hard to define, it's really this planet that in some ways kind of makes us who we are as humans.
Wow. Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. Scott Solomon, it goes full circle with your work too. This question is uniquely yours in so many ways. I mean, you also have this podcast of your own, Wild Worlds. where you are really appreciating the beauty of the planet that we live on, for all of your scientific endeavors, for the fact that ants are your thing and ants make colonies. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just this is for you, and I'm so grateful to you for doing the work and sharing it and communicating it to the rest of us, and for taking this interview with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brad. This has been a lot of fun.